We don't usually follow people we trust. When someone works in our home, and especially for years, there's an unspoken agreement: discretion, respect, boundaries. So when a man like McGregor, successful, controlled, perhaps even emotionally distant, decides to follow his maid, it's not just about curiosity. It's about something breaking, a feeling he can't explain, something unsettling in his gut. Something more than a forgotten object or a missed appointment. Something personal. Behind that decision lies a deeply human conflict, the clash between emotional detachment and unresolved empathy. You see, for many older adults in the US, particularly those in positions of privilege or responsibility, there's often a learned habit of emotional distancing. We become efficient in managing relationships, but poor in feeling them, especially with people we think are in the background: service workers, caretakers, assistants. They move through our lives silently, and we forget they carry stories, pain, history. McGregor followed her not to catch her doing something wrong, but because, and whether he knew it or not, his subconscious had registered something unspoken. A look in her eyes, the weight of her silence, a hesitation that didn't used to be there. And that's where the story really begins, in noticing what's not said. In psychology, we call this empathic rupture, when your internal sense of someone suddenly shifts and you begin to question the reality you've accepted for years. Noticing pain in someone you've overlooked can create a quiet crisis of conscience. It forces you to reckon with your own emotional blind spots. This isn't just about McGregor or a maid. It's about how we relate to people we assume we understand, simply because they're familiar. It's about the stories we miss because we never ask. About the heartbreak we don't see because it's inconvenient to look. Following her that day was more than an act of surveillance. It was an awakening. And when he discovered what she was carrying, it changed something in him permanently. There's a certain kind of work that goes unnoticed. It's not just scrubbing floors or folding laundry. It's the emotional labor of being present in someone else's home without ever really being seen. In the United States, domestic workers, often women, often immigrants, occupy a strange emotional space. They are close enough to witness our private lives, but distant enough to remain socially invisible. This contradiction weighs heavily, especially for those who live day in and day out within the walls of a household not their own. And yet, they're expected to move through that space gracefully, efficiently, and silently. For McGregor, following his maid cracked open a reality he'd never confronted. The truth that while he was preoccupied with his schedule, her life might have been unraveling quietly, step by step. And he hadn't noticed. This is the deeper tragedy of privilege, not malice but emotional disconnection, emotional. We often assume that because we pay fairly, offer holiday bonuses, or say thank you, we've fulfilled our part. But emotional presence isn't transactional. And when someone's pain is unfolding in front of us in small, nearly invisible ways, no amount of compensation can replace the absence of human recognition. From a psychological lens, we can understand this through the concept of compartmentalization, the tendency to separate emotional realms in order to function. It's common among professionals, executives, and even caregivers themselves. You build walls internally to manage life's chaos, but eventually those walls begin to crack, and what comes through often surprises us. When McGregor finally caught a glimpse of his maid's other life, what he discovered wasn't betrayal or deceit. It was endurance. A quiet, tireless strength wrapped in struggle. A series of choices made not for comfort, but for survival. He saw the miles she walked after work, the small apartment she shared with relatives, the child she visited through a cracked daycare window because she couldn't afford more hours. He saw how she held her pain in silence so others wouldn't have to feel it. And maybe, for the first time in years, McGregor felt something beyond curiosity. He felt responsible. That changes a man. There's a strange comfort in not knowing too much. Many people, especially those raised in post-war America or shaped by the cultural optimism of the 1960s and 70s, were taught to focus on self-reliance, ambition, and personal success. The idea was simple. If you worked hard and stayed focused, you'd earn your peace. You wouldn't need to carry other people's burdens. You could draw a line between your life and theirs. But what happens when someone else's pain begins to cross that line? For McGregor, discovering even a glimpse of his maid's reality shattered the protective narrative he'd built around himself. He had always seen her as reliable, quiet, maybe even lucky to have the job. But once he stepped into her world, even for a moment, the emotional disconnect collapsed. And with it came something he hadn't expected: grief. Psychologists often refer to this kind of experience as moral dissonance, the uncomfortable clash between your values and your behavior. When you believe yourself to be fair, kind, even generous, and then you realize you've overlooked someone's suffering. It hurts. Not because you were cruel, but because you were unaware. And being unaware, once you realize it, feels like betrayal. Many older adults in the US find themselves caught in this paradox. They were raised to mind their business, to avoid overstepping, to trust that everyone handles their own problems. But the truth is, emotional invisibility can be more painful than poverty. When your life falls apart quietly and no one notices, especially those around you every day, it's not just lonely, it's dehumanizing. McGregor began to realize that he hadn't just failed to ask. He had chosen not to ask. It was easier that way. Easier not to know. Easier to assume things were fine, but now that he knew, he couldn't go back. He couldn't unsee the look on her face when she thought no one was watching. Couldn't forget the way she lingered by the bus stop late at night, exhausted, alone, unnoticed. He saw her, finally, and it hurt. Sometimes the most painful truths are revealed, not in words, but in silence. After following his maid and witnessing fragments of her reality, the cramped living conditions, the quiet sacrifices, the fatigue she carried like a second skin, McGregor didn't confront her. Not right away. He returned home with more questions than answers, and for the first time in years, he sat in his living room and listened to the quiet. Silence is a powerful teacher. In therapy, we often encourage people to sit with their discomfort instead of running from it. It's in the stillness that repressed emotions surface: shame, regret, compassion, vulnerability. And that's exactly what began to stir in McGregor. He realized that the version of life he'd been living was a curated one, efficient, controlled, emotionally distant. Not cruel, not abusive, but incomplete. He had built his routines to avoid messy realities, to maintain an emotional perimeter. But now the perimeter had been breached, not by force, but by truth. And the truth was this: she had been hurting, and he had never noticed. There's a psychological concept known as attunement, the ability to recognize and respond to the emotional states of others. It's often discussed in the context of parenting or romantic relationships, but attunement matters everywhere, especially with those we see every day but don't really see: our co-workers, our baristas, our housekeepers, our aging parents, our neighbors. McGregor had not been attuned, and that realization cut deep. He began to remember small things, moments that had felt insignificant before. The way she avoided eye contact when she arrived late one day, the time she folded the same towel 3 times, distracted. The mornings she seemed thinner, quieter, her hands trembling slightly. These were the signs, the calls for help not spoken out loud, and he had missed every single one of them. That night he couldn't sleep, not because he felt guilty, though guilt was part of it, but because he felt something more raw, connected. For the first time, he felt emotionally near to someone he had kept emotionally far. And that nearness was both beautiful and unbearably painful. Everyone carries a burden. Some wear theirs on the surface, visible through their expressions, their body language, their words. But others carry theirs in silence, tucked behind tired smiles and habitual kindness. The maid McGregor followed belonged to the latter group. She had learned how to make herself small so others could feel comfortable. It's a survival skill, especially for those who live and work in someone else's world. In the US, it's common to associate emotional strength with resilience, the ability to keep going, to push through. But psychological research shows us a different side. When resilience becomes chronic, it turns into emotional suppression. You don't heal, you endure. And over time, that endurance becomes invisible to those around you. McGregor had lived for decades under the illusion that if someone wasn't complaining, then things were probably fine. This is a deeply American mindset, especially among older generations: self-reliance, stoicism, emotional restraint. But he was beginning to see the flaw in that belief. He realized that the strongest people, the ones who never ask for anything, are often the ones who need the most. In the days following his silent discovery, he started noticing more. Not just about her, but about the world around him. The older man who swept the sidewalk near his building, barely acknowledged. The cashier who worked double shifts and smiled through exhaustion. The neighbor who never received visitors, but always nodded politely. They were all carrying weight, and he had never really seen any of them. This is what psychologists call a rupture of self-image, when your perception of who you are no longer aligns with how you've behaved. It's unsettling, but it's also a powerful catalyst for change. McGregor wasn't a bad man, but he had been emotionally blind, and that blindness had consequences, not just for others, but for himself. Because every time we turn away from someone's pain, we turn away from our own humanity. He began to understand something essential. Compassion isn't about grand gestures. It's about presence. It's about noticing the small shifts, the silences, the tremors in someone's routine. It's about saying, "I see you," without them having to ask. And maybe that was the real weight he had to carry now. There comes a point in life, often after decades of work, relationships, obligations, when a single moment reshapes how you see the world. Not with fireworks or tragedy, but with quiet clarity. For McGregor, that moment arrived one morning when she didn't show up. No message, no call, just absence. And for the first time, he felt genuine concern. Not frustration, not inconvenience, concern. He waited longer than usual, checked his phone, looked out the window. Nothing. That day, the silence wasn't reflective. It was heavy. A kind of dread he hadn't known he could feel for someone he once considered just staff. Because now he knew better. He had seen the life she lived after she left his doorstep. He had felt her exhaustion, even if only by proximity. He had witnessed the loneliness behind her service. When someone disappears, even for a day, it forces you to confront the parts of yourself you'd rather avoid. The parts that didn't ask, didn't care enough, didn't notice until now. Psychologically, this is known as empathic emergence, when genuine emotional awareness surfaces after a long period of disconnection. It's not a light switch, it's more like a sunrise. Slow, subtle, and impossible to reverse. That night, she called. Her voice was quiet, different. Her mother had been taken to the hospital. She had to leave town unexpectedly. She apologized for not calling sooner. And McGregor didn't respond the way he might have weeks before. No mention of rescheduling, no concern for the chores undone. Just one question. Are you okay? There was a pause on the line, long enough to say everything. And then she whispered, "Yes, thank you." It wasn't about fixing her problems. He couldn't. It was about crossing an invisible line, from employer to human being. From emotionally detached to emotionally available, from me to we. And once you've crossed that line, you can't go back. You begin to feel differently, speak differently, live differently. Because the moment you truly see someone, you can never again pretend that you don't. There is a profound human need that transcends class, culture, and circumstance, the need to be seen. Not just looked at, but seen, understood, acknowledged, remembered. For many domestic workers, especially women from marginalized backgrounds, this need is often unmet. Their existence is folded into routines, their names forgotten, their presence treated as part of the furniture, functional, silent, invisible. But when McGregor asked his maid if she was okay, and truly meant it, something shifted in both of them. That simple question carried years of unspoken emotion. It recognized her not as a task, but as a person. Someone with a history, with pain, with love, with a story. In psychology, this act is tied to the concept of mirroring, when another person reflects back your emotional reality, making you feel real and valid. It's something many people don't receive enough of in childhood and even less in adulthood. But when it happens, even later in life, it can be deeply healing. The next time she returned to work, there was no dramatic conversation. No emotional confession, just subtle changes. The way she looked at him when she entered the room, the way he paused what he was doing to greet her, a softening, a mutual awareness. This wasn't about fixing social inequality in a single gesture. It wasn't about guilt. It was about the kind of quiet dignity that arises when two people from vastly different worlds choose to meet each other in truth. McGregor began to realize that for most of his life, he had been surrounded by people he never truly saw. Employees, colleagues, even family. He had defined them by their roles, their usefulness, their reliability. But now he was beginning to ask deeper questions. What are they carrying? What don't I know? What have I failed to see? This new awareness didn't make life easier. In fact, it made it more emotionally complex. But it also made it richer. Because once you open your eyes to someone else's humanity, really open them, the world becomes both heavier and more beautiful. And that perhaps is the first step toward real connection. Change doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in the form of humility. McGregor never told her he had followed her. He never confessed the moment that shattered his emotional indifference. But his behavior changed, subtly, intentionally, and irreversibly. And in that shift, something rare happened. Redemption without spectacle. In the Western world, especially in American culture, we often frame transformation as dramatic, loud, and definitive. But emotional growth, real psychological evolution, often takes root in silence. It's not about announcing a new self, it's about becoming one. McGregor began doing small things. He asked more questions, listened longer, gave time instead of advice. When she needed to leave early, he didn't just say, okay, he said, take care. He began noticing others too. The delivery driver, the woman at the pharmacy, his own adult children who had long ago stopped expecting him to ask how they really felt. This is what psychologists describe as expanded empathy. When your circle of emotional concern grows beyond your immediate interests, it's not about being a savior, it's about being present, fully, without judgment, without control. For her part, the maid didn't change either, not dramatically. She still came at the same time, still folded towels the same way, still worked in quiet rhythms. But her energy softened, her eyes met his a little longer, her voice warmed. Because when someone sees you, really sees you, it gives you permission to exist differently in the world. This story isn't about wealth or status or roles. It's about the moment we choose to cross the emotional distances we've created, sometimes unknowingly, and begin to live in the shared space of vulnerability. For McGregor, following his maid wasn't the story. What he found in himself afterward was, and maybe that's the heartbreak the title speaks of. Not just the pain she carried, but the ache of realizing how long he had lived without this kind of connection, how much he had missed, how many people he had walked past, but now he was awake. And once awakened, the heart does not easily go back to sleep.